The question that is suggested and implied in these scripture lessons today is an important one for people in modern times or any age. How does somebody handle disputes or disagreements, especially if it's something where you have your toes stepped on? And it's mostly intense and can be very, very bruising when it's in the inner circle, your intimates, your family members. But then what happens if outside the family, in general society, you or I may notice misbehaviors or wrongdoings that without any doubt is being perpetrated by someone you know, you're familiar with. Maybe it's a coworker, a friend, a peer, a neighbor. What would be the solution? How do you handle this? Now notice how the prophet Ezekiel begins the insight to this. It's very strict and firm. You know, God speaks to Ezekiel. God's telling Ezekiel, I, who's God, I see somebody over there misbehaving badly, some serious offense. Wickedness is being done. And there's no question, I'm God, it's true, the person's guilty. So your job is to go over, because you're my prophet, and you tap him on the shoulder somehow, you admonish him, you warn him, so he is clear that someone's noticed the misbehavior, like God, and do something about it, change. So Ezekiel is sort of like a whistleblower. He's not responsible to change the person, but at least to awaken him, which often has good effects. But there's an obligation in the Ezekiel reading. Two things are happening. Number one, we must warn a person when there's no doubt that evil's happening. Because if we don't, God says they will be punished, they will be condemned. But then, because God asked someone to tell him, the good guy, the prophet, if he changes his mind and gets afraid or backs off, buries his head in the sand and doesn't tell him, God says, you're also responsible. You saw something and you did not act on it. So two things are happening that are bad, both will be punished. And you can see the consequences in our society today. In terms of major crimes and offenses against people in the last 15, 20 years, or more recently, many cases when crimes are committed and there are victims. And sometimes the victims, for one reason or another, are either unable to or refuse to report the crime immediately. And maybe there are other people involved. I'm thinking of people where there's an abuse like against the Sixth Commandment by this guy who's dead, is Jeffrey Epstein, about a year or so ago. Harvey Weinstein, a very powerful movie mogul, very wealthy. And because women wanted to have important careers in acting and so forth, they could be easily seduced and hit upon. And sometimes they're ashamed to say anything about it. And what happens is the bad side is this guy's finally caught and apprehended and sentenced, both of them. The crime stops, but sometimes it took so long that other people were hit upon, so the crime continues until someone says, that's enough. And that's true also within the scandals within the Catholic Church. We know now that any criminal act should be reported immediately. Call 911. But Jesus is taking it further into a more private sector where the law is not really broken, but my feelings are hurt. Someone has insulted or offended me or stepped on my toes, and the closer the person is to me, the more painful it could be, like a husband to wife in a marriage. That could be very offensive. So Jesus talks not about breaking the criminal civil law. Ancient Israel had severe penalties, though certainly the Romans did. But here's how Jesus says it. He says, quote, if your brother sins against you, brother, family. Okay, in the Hebrew society, your family was very tight. Loyalty in very primitive times, because it was such a hostile, uncontrollable world of foreigners and invasions and stuff that you protected the clan, the tribe, the family, and therefore any offense could really blow it apart. You had to heal that, or great consequences in society. So when someone insults or offends me, it usually can be a private matter that most people didn't know what was going on, but I'm deeply hurt. So Jesus begins to handle it, and if you watch the gospel, he's developing what today in the Catholic Church has developed into our legal system, our procedural laws, how to handle problems and disputes of offenses within the Catholic system not touching the civil law. You do the crime, you pay the time. I go speeding down 208, priest or not, they're going to pull me over. There it is. But this is within the church's matter when serious crimes can happen against not only a physical brother or sister, but fellow worshipers. We are all brothers and sisters in Christ, are we not? So rule number 1 is very important, because 90% of all the problems that are damaging, destructive, and all that, and expensive can be resolved quietly without much ado, if it works. And here's what rule number 1 is. He says, if your brother sins against you, go, tell him his fault between you and him alone. Alone. That's the key word, alone. Close the door, be private. Shake hands, sit down, say, I got a bone to pick with you. Now, why does Jesus say alone? I think common sense would explain why. Maybe there's a mistake. Now, in Ezekiel, God sees an offense. There's no wiggle room. It's the person's guilty. But if I'm hurt by somebody, maybe the problem is if I take them aside alone, they don't realize that I took offense. Or maybe they shot their mouth off and didn't realize how it stings me or embarrasses me, or whatever they did. Or maybe they in some financial activity, someone kind of cheated me or didn't think that I was entitled to something they took, and so on. So alone means let's clarify transparency. What really happened? What is the problem? Another reason why Jesus says do it privately and alone is when the person really is guilty, if I go alone, they are less defensive. They don't build the walls up there. They're open. The possibility of listening in the sense that I really care what you're saying could happen. Done quietly, done politely, in a climate of courtesy and respect. The less shame there is, the less embarrassment, the more easily the person might say, you know, you're right. I was a real obnoxious fool. I really hurt your feelings, and I'm sorry for it. That's all you want to do. But if you threaten to make the person's guilt public, it can be very, very painful. The walls go up, callousing over. The relationship gets very hostile. Now, the real reason for doing it alone is for Jesus and for you and for me, religion. What is the purpose of religion? It's to save people. It's not to create more havoc in society and evil, but rather to change something evil into something good. And Jesus adds that lovely phrase, if you do it privately, and if he listens to you, watch the word if, he listens to you, then you have won your brother over. It's done, there it is. Elsewhere in the gospel, Jesus will make a claim in another episode, settle with your opponent on the way to court. You got litigation, there's a suit going on, maybe we can have an out-of-court settlement over the conference table, a little diplomacy. It'll save a lot of money in legal fees, or you might be the one who finds out you're not going to gain, you're going to lose. The tables could be turned. The great Irish poet and writer Oscar Wilde found out when he took someone to court because he was hurt, didn't settle out, spent 5 years in the Reading jail. So in the real world, things can turn the other way. The whole purpose of religion is always to work throughout our lives, not just here and there, to be repentant, to convert from our evil works and stuff. It's the constant work of God. That's why we have a 40-day Lent every year, to make us sensitive in two ways. That maybe I have to be aware that I can step on other people's toes. I can make mistakes. I'm clumsy at times. And therefore I should be humble enough to be open to some kind of correction. And there it is, at the same time, it softens me up to how to handle people who really have hurt me. Just keep it between the two of us. Very, very delicately done. But Jesus continues. He uses the word, if your brother listens, you have won him over. Meaning, if he pays attention and acknowledges it and says, I've got to change, okay? That's what all you want. Shake hands, life goes on. Easy and less expensive. But he continues, there are people, though, who deny the responsibility for their guilt. Perhaps then, Jesus says, we go to the next step. We bring in some outsiders, not to threaten or accuse, but maybe to bolster the episode. Maybe the person doesn't want to admit it happened. So other people who saw it happen can say, no, you're kind of denying the thing. It did happen, you were doing it, and we saw this. We don't want to threaten and chase you, but maybe you will realize, I can't play the denial game. There it is, making clear the real issue. And that happens within the life of the church. When we have in our tribunals disputes within the church's province, you talk to the persons privately, you try to reconcile privately. If not, then you try to make sure you bring the people involved who touch on the issue to find out what really happened, to keep resolving things in a peaceful but truthful way. And sometimes the perpetrator can change if he realizes that what's happened is noticed and recognized by others, and therefore he has to say, I think my behavior has to change. And that's true in my experience in seminary formation, when we were assigned to parish internship and also internship in hospital visitations. We would be privileged if we were allowed to go to the AA meetings, which are always secret and private. Alcoholics Anonymous, you have a sponsor who brings someone, and the beginning of AA recovery, which is usually successful, not always, usually, is the person has to say to a private group of trusted people who are anonymous, keeping his name a secret, that he has a problem, he has an addiction, and he has to struggle and overcome it. And the support of others are very redeeming. There it is. And the names, of course, only the first names are used. So it's a very, very healthy way to do it. Again, it copies what Jesus is saying in the gospel. But then Jesus goes further. What if we use these peaceful, diplomatic ways to kind of change things without expense or fights or bad feelings that may be permanent through life? What happens when the possibility that the offender will not admit responsibility after all these attempts? And there are people who are so obstinate, so frozen in their own self-righteousness, so stubborn for some reason or another, but nothing, no pleading will work. No decent urging will persuade them to change. I got a dose of that when I came here 14 and a half years ago, and discovered with some people that the predecessor had embezzled. And the process started. First, the civil law, the criminal code. The feds got him first. Trials, I was there. Sentencing, I was there. And then the state trials, that was done. Sentencing, there it was. And finally, the Holy See got involved because he's a priest. And so the Vatican has to try him too once the civil powers are done. In each of those trials, the state, the federal, and the Vatican, he pleaded innocent all the time to everything, even though dozens of parishioners testified in all levels there. So it's possible in Jesus' time that somebody is so frozen, so adamant, for whatever reasons, they'll never admit guilt, even though there's no wiggle room there. And that's why God says to Ezekiel, tell that person doing wickedness it's wrong. He may change. He may not change. If he doesn't, that's not your problem, but at least you pointed it out to him, and to see what happens, to kind of save the person from destroying themselves. Now, there's a problem we're facing today in the modern world in the last 2 decades or so of the 21st century, just within the Catholic system. I'll confine myself to the Catholic Church and not to the civil authorities. The problem we face is that several well-known leaders in our country, here and there, whether it's state, local, or the federal system, who are leaders, who publicly contradict the commandments that St. Paul just put his fingers on for a few moments ago, just described. That is to say, they claim to be Catholic, they wrap themselves sort of in the mantle of Catholicism to an extent, and in their public acts they promote and execute and carry out actions that offend the constant practice of the Catholic Church for 2,000 years, particularly in the area of human life and human sexuality. Paul just pulled 4 of the 10 commandments, did an incredible job of connecting the commandments, which went back to Moses on Mount Sinai. Paul, a rabbi, now an apostle, says they're important. They're the building blocks for civilization. People cannot take the law into their own hands. That's why Jesus starts with one-on-one solo, and maybe 2 or 3. There's a process. Of course, in our legal system, it's more complicated. If people feel injustices have been committed by violent acts of out-of-control police officers here and there, we should trust the legal system. And if it's not good enough, make it good, make it stronger, so the rights of people are addressed, and of course, prevention of violence. But to take it in one's own hands, to perpetrate long-term riots, destroying cities and private property, to tear down statues without legal recourse. The mayor of Richmond had his hand slapped for taking statues down before the city council was asked to vote and make it an ordinance of the city. Work within the law. First, that's peace, security, a sense of justice. Within the Catholic Church, our rules are from God, not from the Pope. Fourth commandment is to honor one's elders, father and mother, especially in the modern church where many adults have an aging parent, and there are aging issues of dementia or disabilities, to care for them. And there are some states that try to advance assisted suicide or some form of euthanasia to put them out of the system because they're past their mentation. That's wrong. It's a form of murder, which is the fifth commandment. Don't commit homicide. Thou shalt not kill the innocent. Well, what about abortion and the unborn life? We keep talking about that. The sixth commandment, human sexuality, same-gender marriage is an insult to the Creator from the very first 2 pages of the Bible, all through history, or other issues on sexuality and permissiveness, including cohabitation and stuff. A free society, we can do what we want. And many leaders who identify with the communion of the church are publicly opposed to it. And that's all branches of government are touched upon that. And of course, thou shalt not steal. So Paul talks about those, and he says something very interesting. I'll come to that in a moment. But in the gospel we just heard that, my concern is, looking at Ezekiel, that God asks certain leaders of the church, called bishops, archbishops, and cardinals, they're the shepherds of the flock, And the question is, I expect the bishop, here and there, to speak somehow to these public leaders. Of course, the rule is privately first. And maybe that's happening. If it's done privately, I'm not supposed to know it, nor you, behind closed doors. I did hear a rumor, which I believe is true, from downtown some years ago. I worked down there 1 or 2 days of the week, that the late Bishop Di Lorenzo, during his episcopate, had to deal with the fact that several governors, senators, congressmen in the state who are Catholic were espousing publicly positions that are directly offensive to God and to the church. And they told me that what the bishop did, following the gospel, met privately with one of, or several, I don't know, this is a rumor, but I believe it's true, to persuade them to change their opinion. And if they didn't, to go one step further and says, if you continue to publicly espouse these destructive policies with your power, you should not appear at the communion rail, because you have put yourself outside communion by opposing the very essence of the church, as Paul described it today in that short reading from Romans. So I think many bishops may have privately took somebody aside and say, straighten up, do what the Lord wants, or else you're not suitable yet to receive communion. Remember, we all line up, distancing. The priest holds up the sacred species. Blessed are those invited to the supper of the Lamb. And we say, the centurion, a pagan, Lord, I am not worthy. You should come under my roof. I'm not worthy. Say the word and I shall be healed. And there are some people who don't want to be healed or to be reconciled, so they put themselves outside the church. That could happen. Now, I don't know if the persons Bishop Di Lorenzo spoke to absented themselves from communion. I don't know. It's none of my business. I'm not the bishop, okay? But I know that some bishops are acting on it privately first. They're not publicizing it in order to persuade conversion, or maybe the leader just refuses to budge. So, how can the church survive, though, if we ignore or tolerate members who take a public stance this way and still say they belong to the faith in its fullness, in full communion? St. Paul said this a few moments ago. He connected the commandments with the phrase about love. Ingenious idea. Love does no evil to the neighbor. Love thy neighbor as thyself. No evil to the neighbor. That's why the church has a strong stand, because some of these positions do evil to other people. They also endanger the person perpetrating it in danger of losing their immortal soul. And Paul adds the phrase, anyone who loves people completely, not just the romantic sweetheart love, but completely, fulfills the commandments because they respect other people's rights and they keep society organized and ordered in a way based upon the wisdom of God if we don't turn those over. So Jesus ended the gospel this morning by saying that wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I'm in their midst. That means because there's more than 2 or 3 people here, he's really present here in our midst. And Paul urged us, says, we owe nothing to anyone except the best. Because God himself, who is here, has held back nothing from us but the best, his Son. And we do our best when we love one another, when we respect one another, when we encourage one another in the living of the faith, and when that slips, to find a prudent way to challenge other people, as God admonished Ezekiel.